I'm Robert Powell, and today I asked a very good friend of mine to come over and assist me with a little bit of a project that I've been interested in. And his name is Shirley Davisson. He's a longtime resident of Victorville. He and I grew up together as kids in the 30s and 40s, and he has a very broad knowledge of the history of Victorville, and he remembers has an awful lot of information stored that I was hoping to have him tell us about the Victorville area. And what we decided we would do, since Victorville in the 30s and early 40s, it was only about 3 miles long. It started in the east, about at the cement plant, and it went down around the corner of 7th and D, then up the street, and it only existed a couple of blocks past the old high school, about where Mojave Drive is now. And that was it. Coming from San Bernardino, you didn't even know you were in Victorville until you came over that last hill, which has been cut down now some, but there was quite a little hill there about where the old shopping center is. And as you came over that hill, the first thing you saw was a house on the right-hand side, and then there was almost nothing, a couple of little cafes, until you got down to what is Forest Street, where the old high school and J. Clay Garrison's Ford garage were. And then Victorville ended as you went past the cement plant. Shirley has a knowledge of what all of the buildings were, who owned them, a lot of information about the buildings. So he and I are going to be talking about that, and he's going to start about halfway in from Ora Grande on the old Atalano Road before the Air Base Road was there. And he'll start with the old country club, which used to be out there with dirt, golf course, and a big swimming pool. We used to go out there when we were kids. And then he'll work his way up to Old 66, and then discuss Victorville, coming along D Street on the right-hand side mostly. Then he'll turn the corner and he'll talk about 7th Street on the right-hand side or west side going towards San Bernardino. And then he'll come back down 7th Street talking about the buildings and the businesses on the right side, all the way back down to Forest Park. So here's Shirley.
On Turner Road, we had the Victor Valley Country Club and golf course, swimming pool. The golf course is all sand and dirt, but it was that was the thing that we had in those particular days. Then as you leave the country club, you're going down Turner Road, right on the bend is Chester Williams' house. Chester Williams bought the property from Richardson, the fellow who started Atlanta, who owned Hot Point. They bought the property in April of 1923, and they was living in the house in June of 1923. Then he had 5 springs that fed water to the house and the swimming pool out in front. And he had across the street, he had the alfalfa field and a big reservoir, lake. Let's see, and then he had an organ, built-in organ in the house. And then as you left Williams' house, the next place was Turner's. The barn was moved from Holcomb Valley by horse and wagon at the turn of the century. The barn still exists to this day. There was no nails, all wooden nails in those days. Across from Turner's, somewhere in towards the river, and I'm not sure which side of the river it was on, was Lane's Crossing. From Turner was Seals, George Seals' property in an alfalfa field. And then we got onto, then you come up and then you turn on Highway 66, and on your left-hand side was a Beer Power and Light. Down from the Beer Power and Light was very attractive housing for the employees. The Fredericks lived there, the Youths lived there, Greenwoods lived there that I remember. Across the street from that was the old hospital. The old hospital, Kenny Jackson was born there. Robert Powell was born there, and Ornelie Fullerton was born there, three that I know. Across from the hospital was Bobby Cope's home, Bobby and Carol Cope. On the same side of the street was the Mojave Springs with the lake out in front, real neat place. Had an apple orchard right below the Mojave Springs, and then next to that was the Sam Rogers Ranch, later owned by Peck, and then the Burkharts, and then Southwestern purchased the land. Then around the bend, right in the corner, was the residence of the chief chemist and the plant superintendent for Southwestern Cement Company. Across the street from that was Southwestern Portland Cement Company. Back across the street and down from the from the superintendent and chief chemist's residence was the Willow Grove Auto Court. Then the Grey Goose. Then you had the Motor Haven Auto Court. And then during the war you had the Red and White Trailer Park. Down from there on 1st and D Street was Cruz's trailer park. She had a little restaurant, gas station. Across from Cruz's was Wanderer's Bulk Station, oil, gas. Across the street from that was the Orange and Black Auto Court.
What street was that on?
That was on 2nd and D. And then next to that was John Roy's Trailer Park. That was built shortly before the war. Then you had the Y, the railroad tracks that crossed Highway 66, went into 3rd Street. That was a turnaround for your locomotives. And then on the right-hand side on 4th and D, you had Nell's Cafe, and then you had around the corner before you got to Jake's Richfield Station, you had the Shady Nook Cafe. Jake's station was a dirt driveway. He watered down every day and raked. It always looked nice and neat. Across the street from that was the Barrel House. The Barrel House liquor store, when I was a kid, they sold ammunition along with the liquor.
It's still there, isn't it, Shirley?
Yes, Babe Russell had the Barrel House when I was growing up. Then in 1942, Corey Moore and Vi bought the Barrel House. That was 1942. And they ran it until into the 90s and then sold. And across the street from there was the rodeo grounds, and also where they played night softball. Next to the Barrel House was Fred's Cafe. Next to Fred's Cafe was a Log Cabin Cafe. Next to that was a Log Cabin Bar. Then eventually the Red Rooster, and then Scotty's. And on the corner of 6th and D was the old Bank of America when I was growing up. Then across the street from that was Sixth and at 6th and D. Across the street from the bank was where the catcher's mound would be for the night softball, and then next to that would be your Forest Park. And back across the street on the corner of 6th and D was Smith Hotel. And then you had the old Safeway. Then you had Crawford's department store. Didn't survive the Depression. Then you had McKinney's Market, which has been there for years and years. Then Snyder's department store. Then you had Alexander's newsstand. Then next to that you had the Stewart Hotel, and then on the corner you had the 5 and 10, and then you turn the corner and going up the street you had the Desert Den. There was a little bar, but before you got to that you had the B&B Cafe. That was the kind of a hangout for all the town people. Then right off the alley you had the Texaco station. Next to the Texaco station you had Turner's Residence. Next to that you had Dr. Lawler. That would be on 7th and C Street. And then next across the street, also on 7th and D, 7th and C, you had Central Pharmacy. And then you had the Sheriff's Department. Then you had Sonetti's Bakery. Then around the corner from that was a little tiny wooden library that lasted till about 1944. Then you had Malcolm Bennett Mortuary. Then a vacant lot, and eventually it was a gas station. Then you had 3 residents. And then you had various businesses on near the corner. You had the malt shop, and you had the cleaners, and so on and so forth. Next to that, across the street, was the signal station. And then you had the Poly station. Then you had J. Clay Garrison. That was the Ford dealership. And then the Webb House was across the street from that. And then you go up the street and you had Leland Butts' station, and then you got mainly vacant land, and then you cross the street where Mojave and 7th Street is the first thing you would see as you entered Victorville. And then you come on down, and
that's if you're coming from
San
Bernardino.
Bernardino. Yes, And then you, as you're approaching town, you had a Smiley station. I remember the sign. It had 5 gallons for $1. That didn't survive the Depression. It went out of business. And then you had a few little restaurant. And then you had let me see, Robert. You had a filling station. Then you had the Victorville Cafe, and then our high school. The high school was started building the high school in 1914. We had our first graduate in 1917, a lady named Ruth Sandberg, and the only student.
All the places you're naming now are on the right side of the street. As you're
Yes, I'm coming down the right side now.
And the ones that you named before were on the left side coming up.
Uh-huh.
So you're at the high school.
I'm at the high school, and I'm coming down now. And right in the island was Wanderers Station, and then you had the Oddfellows Hall. That Oddfellows Hall was built in 1925, and next to that you had Hornby's grocery store. And then across the street from the Oddfellows Hall you had the Associated Station. Next to that you had a large yellow wooden building that Dr. Orr and Dr. Sorensen was in when they first come to Victorville. And then you had a residence on B and 7th Street, and that was Mary Lunsford's house. Well, she moved that house over on 8th Street and built her market there, Lunsford Market. Then you come down, then you had Powell's Appliances on your right-hand side. Then you had the old Daily Press that was established in 1937. And then you had Dr. Thayer, that was related to the Yuckaloma Great Bear. And then you had, down the street, you had the post office. Then you had the signal station. And then you had the Shell station on the corner. And right behind the Shell station, you had the Mesa Theater. Then, next to the Mesa Theater, you had the Green Spot Motel. Then on the corner of 7th and C, you had Green Spot Cafe. That was open 24 hours a day. It was also the Greyhound bus stop. Very active. And that's where they used to, the buses would stop and they could go in and eat at the Green Spot. Then next to the Green Spot, you had the Green Spot Bar Annex. And then eventually, during the war, you had the bowling alley. Then next to that, you had Razors. That was built later. And then that was the Razors department store. And then you had the Standard Station. That would be the Webb station. And then you had, next to that, you had Cal Goodrich's garage. Then on the corner, you had Bowers Drugstore. Bowers Drugstore, that was our second post office in Victorville, and that was in 1909. That's when the post office was on the corner. And then across the street from Bowers, you had the Haywood Lumber Company, and then the park. And I might say that at one time, all the activity was on the East Street side of Victorville. And people at that time wanted to stay close to the water, the Mojave River. And then as Victorville began to grow, well, then it was landlocked, so then they started coming across the tracks. I might mention that the Barrel House was a residence in the early 1900s, Talmadges. That was a residence for the Talmadges. And then across the tracks, the Talmadges had a blacksmith shop, and also across the tracks you had the Turner department store, and then you had Richardson's department store, the Santa Fe Hotel, and then quite a few things. Like I say, they was landlocked, so then they finally come across the tracks in the early 1900s. Santa Fe Railroad. My dad was a telegrapher for Santa Fe Railroad. He started in the Los Angeles Division in 1924, and he worked at the Cajon station. He worked in the Hodge station. He worked at the Victorville station. And he worked at the Wild station. Wild is close to Hellendale now. There was this. You had to have, in those days. You had to have depots every 5 miles on a single trackage. Anytime you had a single trackage on a main line, you had to have a depot every 5 miles. They had to be manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That was for communication problems. So my dad, like I say, he worked for the railroad, started in 24, but on the main line, when you had single trackage going through Victorville, you had stations at San Bernardino, then you had a station at Ono, right out of San Bernardino, then you had a station at Devore. You had a station at Cajon. That's where my grandfather worked. He was a telegrapher also. And that's where my dad was working there when he met my mother. she was going to San Marino High School. She was a student there in the 20s. And then from Cajon, then you had the Summit. You had a station at Summit. You had a station at Lugo. Then you had a station at Hesperia. You had a station at Victorville, Oro Grande, Dryman, Wild, and then you had Hodge, and then Linwood, then Barstow. Anytime you had single trackage, and we had single trackage through Victorville until that would be 1925, and then as they started getting in double lines, well, then you could eliminate some of the depots. And the Wild station was eliminated. The Dryman station was eliminated. Some of the stations, was all eliminated. The Hodge station was eliminated. Ono, Devore stayed for many, many years. Cajon was very active up until into the 70s. And then Lugo they closed it. Victorville was they closed Hesperia. Victorville was very, very active. A lot of demurrage. They had cement plants and they shipped. So they was very, very active. Oro Grande was a very active depot. Then of course Barstow. Barstow had a Harvey House, and they used to stop the trains where you go in and eat, then get back on the train and take off again. Kind of super.